Today I'm joined by Voon Lee, who's going to be talking about updates to the Singaporean immigration program. We're going to go over some updates to the borders, how visitors are being handled, temporary work permits, permanent residency, compliance, and we're going to wrap up with some top tips shared by Voon. So I'll pass over to Voon to introduce himself, and then we can talk very briefly about what's going on the ground in Singapore.
Hi everyone, my name is Woon Lee. I'm currently a consultant in the immigration for APAC, running my own team in Singapore.
Very good. So now, what's happening in Singapore right now? Is there a lockdown? Is that going to change? Is it being re-reviewed? I know there's certain phases, so where are we at right now?
Singapore has been hit by the outbreak in the dormitory for foreign workers. Over 95% of the cases are concentrated on this foreign dormitories, foreign workers dormitories. And currently, the local transmitted cases are very low in the community. So we are hopeful that the partial lockdown that since April 7 will be relaxed by next week, which is after the 2nd of June, and more businesses will be allowed to open. But we still need to watch over the social distancing measure and to ensure that as much as possible, split the team, have some of the employee working from home, and the non-essential business will still continue to be closed for the time being. And then it will be a 3-phase opening. First phase will be the more businesses will be allowed to open. Second phase will then go into school being reopened and certain limited social gathering allowed. And phase 3 will be as much as possible go back to our new norms, not the usual normal life.
Okay, very good. Now let's move into what's happening with updates in immigration. First of all, how are the borders being handled in Singapore? Are they open, closed? And if they are closed, who is able to come in, if anyone?
At the moment, the borders is closed. Only Singaporean and permanent residents are allowed to come back. And when they come back, then they will be mandatory quarantine for 14 days. What we say a short stay-home notice at the designated facility that's provided by the government, right? Anyone that's and any resident in Singapore are encouraged to defer any traveling overseas for the time being. If they have to travel, there's no guarantee that they will be allowed to come back. If Singaporean and PR will be allowed to come back, they will then have to foot the bill for their quarantine facility when they return to Singapore.
Right. Okay. And now let's turn our mind to visitors. If you are on a visitor visa in Singapore, are you expected to depart Singapore immediately, or are you provided extensions to allow to remain in Singapore?
It all depends on the situation. For country that that is still close at the home country or the country of destination,
right?
They can't travel, and obviously their visa will be extended until such time that the border is open for them to travel back to the home country.
Okay.
Right? And for those who have extenuating reason to stay on in Singapore, they can then seek the authorities' approval to extend the visa, probably closer to the expiry, a week, within 5 working days. They can then go to the immigration department to seek an extension. Yeah, and note that any non-resident any resident who's currently holding an employment residence visa or dependent visa will have to seek approval before returning to Singapore.
Right.
If they return without getting approval, their work visa or resident visa will be revoked, and employers may be subject to a ban in hiring foreign employees for up to a year.
Wow, so that's really important. Now, how would you obtain that guidance or pre-clearance to come back into Singapore?
Basically, anyone, any residents or any work pass holder that required currently overseas wanted to come back to Singapore, the employer will have to submit an application to the Ministry of Manpower. Upon the approval, then they can make the trip back to Singapore, and then subject to the 14-day stay home notice.
And how long does that process typically take?
It's pretty fast. It's usually within 3 to 5 working days.
Okay, so planning ahead's really important, and especially the ramifications of non-compliance with that seems to be very, very steep. So important point there. Now let's shift over into temporary work permits.
Just one more thing is that all returnees must submit a health declaration.
Okay.
Yeah, upon return.
And is that something that would be self-drafted? Is there an official notice?
It is a form that you can do it online, before returning. Yeah.
Okay, very good. So now let's move into temporary workers. Any foreign worker that's currently in Singapore and they're facing an extension, are there automatic extensions to their work permits, or are they expected to file an extension? If so, when should they be doing that?
Currently, all the current work pass holders are allowed to, all their passes will be extended to 1st July. If it's coming up for extension and they have no time to do the extension. But the ministry is still continue to accept a renewal application. So you can plan forward at any work pass that's coming up for renewal, plan it forward, submit it a couple or few weeks before their expiry. For someone who has end for example, under the normal circumstances, when one terminate the employee, the work pass will be terminated and will be issued a social visit visa for up to 30 days, right, to stay on Singapore. Should the travel restrictions still extend beyond the 30 days, like I said before, you can always go and ask for extension for the visa.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Now, if there are changes to one's employment, so maybe a reduction in salary, changes to their worksite location, are those types of material changes that need to be recorded with the Singaporean officials?
I think during this period, yes. Let me go back a little bit. Under normal circumstances, the reduction in salary will need to be reported. I would say that go ahead to report it, but if you don't, I think it's only for temporary, just for 1-2 months or reduced work hours. I would think that the ministry will understand about this and would not take this as a long-term reduction of salary. Yeah.
Okay.
But the home address or the residential address need to be updated as soon as they change resident address. Okay,
very good. Yeah. Now, in the event that somebody loses their job due to the coronavirus or otherwise, are there any provisions in place for individuals to remain in Singapore and apply for another job, or have a grace period of sorts?
The grace period, like I say, is the 30 days given.
Right.
Once the work pass has been terminated, they will be given a 30 days social visit visa. If you have found a new job, you can then apply for a new work visa, what we call employment pass in Singapore, and then just wait for the approval to come. Should the approval take longer than normal, you can then ask for extension of this social visit visa, or continue to stay on in Singapore for both the employees as well as their family members as well.
Okay, good to know. So now let's swiftly move into some of the changes to the permanent residency program in Singapore. How have the permanent residency program been impacted by this?
There is a huge backlog of permanent residency application. They are not stopping the application. You can still go and do an online submission for
Right.
the permanent residency application, right? The only thing is that the immigration department was closed for a while, and hopefully by next week certain services will be resumed, and those who have obtained in principle approval can then continue, maybe allowed to make the journey to Singapore. For those who are not allowed to make the journey, they will continue to be overseas for a period of time.
Okay.
This applies to the work pass application as well. Those who have obtained in principle approval occurring overseas will have to seek approval to come into Singapore to take up the employment. Right?
Okay.
So I think currently the approval given are only to those in critical and essential services.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move into talking about compliance. It's obviously compliance around the world is very important, despite or regardless of what's going on in terms of the pandemic. So we touched on a couple of pieces of key compliance in Singapore, and they seem to have very serious ramifications if you violate those. What are the top compliance aspects that you would be encouraging your clients and other professionals to really focus on during this period?
As I mentioned, traveling, coming back to Singapore, it's important to make sure that approval is obtained before the employee makes a trip back to Singapore, right? And defer as much as possible, any travel out of Singapore, right? And also at the same time, to ensure that the current work passes for your employee are still within the expiry. All those work passes or dependent passes that's coming up to renewal, please make sure the application is submitted prior to the expiry, and it need be ask for extension of any employees who are currently overseas with the in-principle approval obtained. The in-principle approval letters are usually valid for 6 months. So the other point here that I'm trying to make is that employers or employees with certain compelling reason to make the essential travel can still seek the authority approval to make the trip and to come back to Singapore. It will be approved on a case-by-case basis, right? And in Malaysia, for example, they already mentioned, although they close the border, they will allow Malaysians to come back every day from Singapore. There will be up to 400 of them can apply for a return back to Malaysia. And if you have, but they need to be quarantined for 14 days as well back to Malaysia. And the other thing is that if you have to attend certain funeral, they will allow you to go back for 3 hours, which then is something that, because the reason why I mentioned here is that there are about few 100,000 of them working in Singapore that used to cross the border on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so really important guidance there. Let's wrap this up talking about a few tips. And I know throughout this you've scattered in some great nuggets of information for employers, professionals to really focus on. But if you were to list out a handful of really good top tips, what would you be encouraging your clients and professionals to focus on?
I would say that if there is any upcoming assignment, from anyone coming from overseas, let's prep the work first. I'm sure in time to come, in the next couple of months, the border will be reopened slowly, already there have been talks by the ministers and of various ministry talking about allowing essential business travel to a couple of countries. Of course, this will have to be a bilateral or a multilateral discussion between the countries. The country that mentioned in the initial stage was Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Korea, Japan, and China. So the 6 countries being mentioned, and hopefully, there's some good news coming out, and then, I'm sure there will be certain process put in place for company or employers or employees to make an application, and once allowed to travel. The only things that I'm still very eager to look at is how are they going to do the quarantine, or is there some health declaration given, or maybe some certification given that you are COVID-19 free before you can travel. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense for someone to go into a country and be quarantined for 14 days back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And also, I think the other point that one of the ministers mentioned, that they are also looking into the inter or intra ASEAN country travel to be allowed. Yeah. So this is such a closely knitted country. So once the virus cases being under control in this ASEAN country, I think slowly a limited travel will be allowed soon. So all this will have an impact on businesses, as well as the work visa application. And the other point that I need to mention is that for any foreigners that you hire in Singapore, the application can still be submitted and processed as per normal. So anyone in country can continue to do a change in employment or applying for a new job if you're in Singapore at the moment. So the control is actually to stop the imported cases back to Singapore.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, Voon, thank you so much for sharing this valuable information. I know it will be really, really valued by our viewers. So with that, we'd like to thank you. We'll wrap this up. What's the best way for anyone who has questions to contact you?
On my LinkedIn page, and then I would have my emails and contact detail there.
Again, thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you, Arvinda. Thanks. Cheers.
Okay.